Can't hear me, can you?
Or me.
How about now?
Yo.
That's better.
Mic's on, right?
All right, I hear the familiar echo of an amplified voice. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Griffith Observatory. Welcome to our celebration of Apollo 11. How many of you were on the lawn for the launch? Yeah, that was really high tech, don't you think? We challenged those Apollo 11 engineers with our own mission to the moon. 30 seconds late. We are very happy to welcome you to this, the first of 8 days in a row of celebrating Apollo 11. We also welcome our guests if you're watching it on YouTube or live stream. I'm Dr. Laura Danley. I'm the host of All Space Considered, along with Dr. David Reitzel, Patrick So, and Tony Cook. We're here the first Friday of every month to give you the latest and greatest in space and astronomy news and headlines. So what greater news in astronomy and space is there on July 16th? I guess I'll say 2019, but on July 16th, 1969, the big headline, of course, was the launch of the first mission to set foot on the moon. So we're here to celebrate that and to tell you a little bit more about this mission and its launch a year ago. Before I get started, I just want to make a couple of quick announcements. One is that if you need to leave, you should go out back the doors you came. That is an emergency exit. That is a closet. You don't want to go there. We have had people had to sheepishly come out. You can keep your cell phones on, but there's no reception in here. So your phone will be roaming, looking for signal, and it will waste battery. So you might want to go ahead and turn it off, or at least put it in airplane mode so it doesn't drain down while we're telling you about the mission. And then I just want to ask, are there any members of Friends of the Observatory here? Thank you. Nice members of Friends of the Observatory. Friends of the Observatory is Griffith Observatory's partner and support organization that allows people to contribute and support things like our 5th grade school field trip program. Many of the equipment that you see around here, the projectors, the planetarium system, the planetarium show production. So we are always grateful for your support. And if you think you'd like to, since this is free, you can drop $1 in one of those bins over there, and then that will go help the kids and Friends of the Observatory, and we'd be grateful for that. And then lastly, I always like to ask at All Space Considered, how many tax-paying citizens of the city of Los Angeles? Okay, not so many taxpayers. Okay, that's because you're not paying your taxes or because you don't live in that's a little worrisome. Well, for those of you who are paying your taxes and the rest of you, thank you, because Griffith Observatory is a municipal observatory. We are owned and operated by the city of Los Angeles, the Department of Recreation and Parks. We're a city park, but just a very special one with a very special facility here. So thank you to all of you for making all of this possible. So without any further ado, the music you don't have to guess about. That was indeed the top 6 songs from this week in 1969. So I'm sorry to have to subject you to that last one, which will be stuck in your heads for the rest of the day. But that was the #1 song, and we always strive for accuracy here at Griffith Observatory. So I hope you enjoyed the music and it made you feel like if you trip back to 1969. So of course the origins of the Apollo mission don't start in '69. They really start back in 1957 with the launch of Sputnik by the Soviet Union. It shocked the world and was a rouse to attention for the United States that perhaps the Soviet Union was beating us in the race to space. And in fact, there were many firsts for the Soviet Union. We answered with a mission called Explorer 1. There were a couple of more missions in between, but then lo and behold, they did it again, beat us on April 12th, 1961 by sending the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin. And we answered that about a month later with Alan Shepard. So we were not the first, and this was a bit of a concern. So it's kind of shocking. Also, by the way, shortly after the Alan Shepard flight was the Bay of Pigs, a very difficult time in the United States, a very politically charged time in the United States. So hard to imagine that 3 weeks later, the President of the United States went to Congress to ask for money. And this is what he said.
These are extraordinary times, and we face an extraordinary challenge. Our strength, as well as our convictions, have imposed upon this nation the role of leader in freedom's cause. Finally, if we are to win the battle that is now going on around the world between freedom and tyranny, the dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. Now it is time to take longer strides, time for a great new American enterprise, time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth. I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I had earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
So I played the longer clip just to give you the historical and political environment in which he made that statement. And it was only 3 weeks after we put our first person in space. And he's already saying we're going to, by the end of the decade, put a man on the moon, which was pretty much synonymous with crazy talk at that time, and bring him back safely. You'll notice that they didn't clap when he said that, which I thought was kind of interesting. But it was nonetheless a bold challenge, and of course, the nation rose to that challenge, and that's the story of space exploration in the 60s. We tend to think of it as a space race that was all about beating the Soviets, but not a lot of people know that, in fact, he also recommended that we might do it together, and offered a partnership to do our moon program, to have set people on the moon in partnership with the Soviet Union, which is quite extraordinary to think about. But nonetheless, that's not how it unfolded. We continued with the Mercury program, of which Alan Shepard was a part. And after that was just one man in a capsule. The first two were suborbital, didn't orbit. Then from John Glenn and the rest, they orbited the Earth. And toward the end of that, here they are, the Mercury 7, the famous 7 brave astronauts who were the first Americans in space. And then after that, a year later, he was trying to rouse public enthusiasm for this, for the program to put a man on the moon, and gave a speech in Texas. And this is a somewhat famous speech. Again, it's about a minute long, I'll play for you. But when you hear him trying to explain it to people, you must think this man is either crazy or incredibly brave, or probably a little bit of both.
Even though I realize that this is, in some measure, an act of faith and vision, for we do not now know what benefits await us. But if I were to say, my fellow citizens, that we shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat in stresses, several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communication, food, and survival, on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that of the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first, Before this decade is out, then we must be bold. I'm the one who's doing all the work, so just watch the tape go. However, I think we're going to do it. And I think that we must pay what needs to be paid. I don't think we ought to waste any money, but I think we ought to do the job. And this will be done in the decade of the 60s. It may be done while some of you are still here at school, at this college and university. It will be done during the terms of office of some of the people who sit here on this platform. But it will be done. And it will be done before the end of this decade. And I am delighted that this university is playing a part in putting a man on the moon as part of a great national effort.
I'm going to stop it there. This is the speech where he goes on to say, we choose to go to the moon not because it is easy, but because it is hard, a famous quotation.
Actually, hard.
Hard. Oh, pardon me. Yes. Yes. Thank you, Tony. Important correction.
Why does Rice play Texas?
Why does Rice play Texas, right? So anyway, moving on, we did commit to that. The next stage was the Gemini program, this time sending 2 people into space, learning how to walk in space, how to rendezvous in space. These are the Gemini astronauts. And there's Ed White on the first time a man floated, American astronaut floated in space, Gemini capsule, and that brings us to Apollo. And the whole purpose of Apollo was to land us on the moon, as this nice artist's depiction shows. So the basic idea is that there are a couple of components. You've got this service module is basically the rocket with all the systems, the command module where the astronauts sit, and then this little crazy looking bug thing called the Lunar module, which would detach from the command module, go down to the moon, take astronauts there, and then just the top part, just this part, would return, dock again with the command module. It would be put back into an orbit that sends it back to Earth and bring them home safely. And that's the basic trajectory. So of course you needed some rockets to do that, a lot of technology to develop. I will skip through most of this other than to say there was quite a bit of rocket development. We have more discussion about this in some of our earlier versions of All Space Considered Remembers Apollo. And so with the development of that rocket, the Saturn rocket, there's the Saturn I and the Saturn V, that led to what was to be the first mission, Apollo 1. Here is the crew of Apollo 1, and many of you are aware, and perhaps some of you are not, that Apollo 1 never launched because there was a tragic accident on the pad during a test where the capsule caught fire and all 3 of the astronauts perished. So this was an enormous setback in a very ambitious program, devastating to all involved. It was like a large family working so hard together to make this goal come true. So there was a pause in the program. Apollos 2 and 3 were canceled. Then 4, 5, and 6 were all, again, hardware tests. No crew on board to test the Saturn V rocket, to test the Lunar module, or sometimes called the LEM. And then Apollo 6 was a very important one because they had developed a special rocket that would send us to the moon, fire again to put the astronauts in orbit around the moon, fire again to bring the astronauts on that orbit that took them back home. And I mention this because Apollo 6 had problem after problem. And that special rocket they developed to take us to the moon, the Saturn 4B, had failed, misfired. There were problems throughout. There was not a single successful, proper test of that rocket. And that is amazing, not the rocket, but the engine that would take us to the moon on the Apollo 6 mission. So it's even more amazing then that the next mission, Apollo 7, put astronauts in orbit around the Earth, and then Apollo 8, we sent them to the moon anyway. Apollo 8 was supposed to be the lunar module test, but the lunar module wasn't ready. So they said, okay, well, we got to stay on schedule here if we're going to do this by the end of the decade. So they sent Apollo 8 to the moon using that rocket that had failed in Apollo 6. Well, we think we understand the problems. We're going to do it. I mean, imagine the bravery, the spirit, can-do spirit of just maybe the insanity of doing this, but they did it. And of course, that was a famous mission for this famous photograph that is more famously shown that way, the picture of Earth rising over the moon's surface. 2 more missions, Apollo 9, the lunar module is ready. That was tested. All of these missions, again, are on our YouTube channel. You can see the talks we gave about them. And then Apollo 10, the great dress rehearsal that happened just a month and a half earlier, or just 2 months earlier, to take all the systems to the moon, fly the lunar module close to the surface, but not land and come home. And of course, that was a great success. So that brought us to the mission we celebrate today, Apollo 11. These are the extraordinarily brave men who got on board that Saturn V rocket. This is a little bit of a profile of the mission. As I mentioned, it starts at Earth, it goes into orbit around Earth, and then that rocket, the one that failed on Apollo 6, sends you to the moon, and then it fires again, puts you into orbit. The lunar module drops off, lands on the moon, and then after the walk on the moon is complete, this is all on paper here, it launches again, goes into orbit, rendezvous, and then that rocket fires one more time to bring astronauts back to Earth, and fires a final time to send them to splash down to Earth. So that is the crazy mission on which we embarked. So Patrick, can you tell us what happened?
Sure. So the launch of Apollo 11 took place on a clear, sunny day in Florida. Of course, it was summertime, and it was hot and humid. Millions of people visited the Cape. They camped. Some of them came early, camped out and to watch the launch of Apollo 11. And a launch it was. So let's go ahead and roll the video as seen from television broadcast and watched by millions.
Oh boy. It's Walter Cronkite's voice.
The rocket takes 12 seconds to clear the tower and reaches speed of sound in 1 minute. And people who were watching about 3 miles away, the shock waves were so intense they could literally feel their clothes kind of wave. So here is a view from the firing room from at the Cape. And the next image has the rocket ascended. It was very humid, so you can see this big cloud of condensation just over the top of the second stage. And then 12 minutes later, after the first and second stage, the astronauts got this beautiful view of the Earth. They were in orbit for 1.5 orbits, and then the Mission Control commanded them to do a TLI, which is a trans-lunar injection, which basically meant firing the third stage engine right here, and then accelerating them from 17,000 miles per hour, which is orbital speed, to escape the Earth's gravity, and then attaining a speed of 24,250 miles per hour, and leaving the Earth's gravity on a course to the moon. 4 hours later, they needed to retrieve the lunar module, which was stored in the third stage, and you can see the sequence of it. And after they did that, they did a mid-course correction on the way to the moon. So this is a view looking towards the lunar module as was docked from the command module. And you can see already has just how small the Earth is, and a distance of about 100,000 miles away from Earth. So during that time, they were on a 3-day cruise towards the moon. And
one of the activities the astronauts had to do every few hours was to make sure that their guidance and navigation computer was lined up with reality. So the Apollo spacecraft had gyroscopes that would keep track of the orientation And to know that the directions were actually matching reality, MIT had designed a whole system so there were telescopes and sextants on board that the astronauts could look and identify 37 bright stars. If they could align on one or two of them, they knew that they were aligned right. So the reason we mention this is that most of the Apollo astronauts came to Griffith Observatory as part of their training. We have on display a chair that was designed by Apollo 9 astronaut Rusty Schweickart so his colleagues could get the kind of view you'd see through the instruments on the Apollo. And they were allowed to control the planetarium and line up on the different stars that they had to confirm for their computer. They'd look at a star, identify it, and when it was centered right, they put a command in their computer to let them know that the alignment was complete.
It's kind of crazy, isn't it, to think they steered by the stars?
Yeah.
I mean, the computer did some work, and those computers were not as powerful as your own cell phone. But still, we
Right.
navigated by the stars.
That's right, and that was the whole basis of Apollo. It started with that system, and everything was kind of built out from that. And that's how they were going to get their confirmation.
Which astronauts are pictured?
Okay, in this picture, you see the director, Clarence Clementshaw, on the left, Rusty Schweickart from Apollo 9 standing next to him, Jim McDivitt, then Al Worden, Dick Gordon, and Al Bean, who are on various Apollo missions. And seated in the chair is Dave Scott, who is the, well, he was on Apollo 9, but he also was the first to drive a car on the moon on Apollo 15.
Yeah, and also we have Dave Scott's signature on a helmet on display in the depths of space right now. Now that isn't a real Apollo helmet, it's a replica, but it's really his signature. Seventh man on the moon signed one of the pieces on display in the depths.
And we have another helmet that's signed by Michael Collins, who is the command module pilot. In other words, the person who had to stay behind in the Apollo capsule while his colleagues walked on the moon on Apollo 11. But he also came to Griffith Observatory. This is our director's logbook, and you can see the penciled in mark where he has the names of the astronauts that visited on Thursday, 27th October, 1966. And Mike Collins is one of them. And this is just basically showing the workings of that chair contraption, which you can see on display just outside on the lower level here.
Okay, so as the spacecraft neared the moon, it went into a lunar orbit insertion, so with the rockets firing from the command module, slowing it down and taking it into a 60-mile orbit around the moon. So it was in lunar orbit. Next, there was the transfer of the astronauts. And from the lunar module, they can actually see the landing site, which is indicated right here. They also nicknamed some other features that they needed to see as they approached the moon, such as US Highway 1, Sidewinder, this little line here, Diamondback and Boot Hill, and some craters, of course. And so now it was, after 13 orbits, it was time to land, and mission control said, we'll go for power descent. So what did that mean? So let's go to the next slide. So while the lunar module undocked from the command service module, the command service module continued to orbit 60 miles above the lunar surface. At this point, which is PDI, power descent initiation, the lunar module descended to about 50,000 feet, which is just a little bit higher than the jet airliner. And for about 8 minutes, its descent engine would ignite and slow it down and bring it down towards the surface. This P63 means that the whole landing sequence was guided by a series of programs, and that was braking phase was done by program 63.
Before you go on, I just want to make the comment that the engine, this descent engine, had to be designed specially for this mission. No one had had a purpose to land on the moon before. And engineers who designed and built that engine are going to be here tomorrow night. So if you live in the neighborhood, come back tomorrow night, meet some of the original engineers who actually did it, or watch it on our live stream or YouTube channel. So, from TRW, yes. So, Patrick, go ahead.
Okay, so the computer controlled the thrust. It was a variable thrust descent engine, and it would come down to a certain height called high gate, where literally the lunar module would pitch over, and this was called the approach and visibility phase, where the commander, Neil Armstrong, could literally look out the window and see those features that was on that map earlier on to make sure that they were in the right place and look for a landing spot. And by the time the next program came into progress, P-66, they were in the landing phase. At this time, the commander had an option of actually manually controlling the landing down to touchdown. So the next slide shows us the computer, which is known as the Pollens guidance computer. And by today's standards, of course, it is very
Not 36K.
Yes, that's right, 36K. So the Pollens, it actually has, all the programs were written in 36K of read-only memory, and there was 2K of RAM. And today, we don't even talk about megabytes. We talk about gigabytes, which is a millionfold the capacity of kilobytes. So the computer needed to control the descent. So it took 90% of processing power to know where the lunar module was relative to the surface in attitude, altitude, and velocity. During the landing, 2 program alarms came up, and they were caused by the rendezvous radar being enabled and taking 13% of the processing power, which took it over the 100% limit.
And how long before landing was that?
And that was actually occurring like minutes before the landing. And so every time these computer alarms go off, the computer literally stopped and rebooted, and then all of a sudden these recovery programs, thanks to Margaret Hamilton at MIT, who was the lead software specialist who programmed this, would actually pick up where it left off. So that was amazing, because that actually saved the landing. But at that time, Mission Control did not know what these alarms were, and Neil Armstrong called out, said, do you have a reading on this 1201? And the flight director had to call back to Steve Bales, who was the guidance officer, and he called back to the back room, which is the people who are the experts on these computer programs. And a person by the name of Jack Garman said he had seen this before, and he said, it should be okay. It's just you know, it's just the executive overflow, whatever that means. Just tell them go on that alarm. And then Steve Bell said, okay, we'll go on that alarm to Gene Kranz, who was the flight director, and he called to the Capcom and said, all right, we'll go on that alarm. But it was terrifying.
Which astronaut is operating the computer during this?
Actually, Aldrin was, and he's pictured here. This is a composite picture, so Aldrin doesn't have an extra arm. But every time there was if they said no go on that alarm, the astronaut would reach for this button in the center of the flight controls, which is called the abort stage. You can see it right there. And of course, we know they never did that.
Is the communication delay a couple minutes?
No, it's 1.5 seconds round trip.
Thankfully.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's important to think about when you think about Mars, because if we are to try to land on Mars, that delay makes completely different.
Right. Now, so for the landing, a 60-millimeter camera was attached to the window of the lunar module pilot, so that's Buzz Aldrin's station. So we can actually see the landing as it happened. But the film was developed afterwards, and so no one actually saw the landing. It was actually an audio experience. And we're going to go ahead and run a video, but we've edited it so you can hear all the alarms and all the stages towards landing, and you can see here and what experience it is.
Which view on the left?
So on the left, this is the actual CBS live broadcast of the landing with actually not computer simulation, with a simulation.
Yeah, not computer.
Right. So they're at 30,000 feet. They're looking into the alarm, and it took them 20 seconds later.
Oh, great go.
Now there's a call for go for landing. The AG is Apollo guidance computer. So at this point, Neil Armstrong notices that they're going into a crater, so he takes control of it because there's a boulder field with boulders the size of cars. So now he's manually guiding the lunar module over the crater.
Yeah, 5% fuel.
Yeah, the 5% is a red line. Watch this guy.
Good home.
Here's a response.
Oh, jeez. Good. Oh, boy. Boy. You always say something, I'm speechless. I'm holding my breath. That is really something.
That was Wally Schirra, who was the commander of Apollo 7.
How many of you remember that day? How many of you cried? Right. Right? Oh, we all did. We all were like that. I am right now. It was an incredibly powerful moment. And for those of you who didn't live through it, I hope that there will be a similar moment for you guys sometime soon. I understand there are some people who had a story to tell about it. Are they still here?
All the way at the top.
Can you just very briefly tell us your story?
Mum and Dad celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary, and they witnessed it on their honeymoon the day after they got married.
Thank you.
Yay.
Yeah, I think a lot of people have a story like, not necessarily like that. Most of us were at home in our living rooms with our families, watching it on TV. But it was an incredibly beautiful moment. So Patrick, tell us what happened next.
Okay, so this is just to show you from 4 minutes how they descended in terms of altitude. At this point, manual control was assumed. And we can go to the next slide, and every line there shows you every second of that landing. And then go to the next slide. The landing, planned landing spot wasn't achieved. They were just about 4 miles off course and just about nearly a mile cross range. But that was okay. That was fine. They would have landed in that big crater if they let the computers take charge with lots of boulders. So they didn't need to do that.
Okay, then through the miracle of television, we actually got to watch the first steps on the moon. What we're seeing is the first encounter with the lunar environment. Neil Armstrong's coming down the ladder.
So you're coming down the ladder now?
See? And before he steps off onto the moon, he wants to make sure he can get back up into the lunar module. So he,
Okay, I just checked, get back up to that first step, so that doesn't collapse too far, but it's adequate to get back up.
yeah, the ladder ended up a little higher over the surface than they had planned because the legs didn't compress in as much as they thought they would.
And so
So
after
then-
that?
Yeah, then, of course, the moment we were all waiting
At the
for.
foot of the ladder, the left foot bands are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's about
And actually, during the live TV transmissions on CBS, they actually couldn't make out quite what he said, so they had to. Oh,
Wow, he's walking pretty well. I expected him to be. Neil, how nice of you to join us from 50 years ago. How is? Well, I know you can't talk to us, can you? So that's sign language. Do you have a good ride? And you saved the mission. Thank you for that. So we're grateful for Neil. Neil will be kind of around here and there, saying hello to visitors. And we are grateful to Global Effects for providing his.
just mention on the suit. Remember the moon? At the moon, there's no atmosphere, so the sun shining on, a human body would be 210 or something degrees Fahrenheit. And then in the shadow, it gets down to about 240 degrees below zero. So just absolutely horrible, extreme environment in a vacuum. So the spacesuit really is a spacecraft in a way. It has all the life support, the pressure needed, and water circulating through tubes to equalize the temperature. So it was an amazing piece of technology. And it weighed on the Earth something like 200 pounds, but Moon's 1/6 gravity, so.
Yeah, so if you haven't done it, go weigh yourself on the moon. It's very heartening.
Yeah.
Okay, so
All right.
after that.
Yeah, so then, now Neil's first job is really to pick up a rock, just so they have something in case they have to leave fast. So the contingency sample is what he's supposed to be doing, but instead he decides to take a panorama. So they have to start nagging him. Keep in mind,
I have a child who's, I'll get, as soon as I finish taking this picture.
so Buzz finally was able to come down once that contingency sample was obtained. And now we'll see Buzz go through somewhat the same thing. He has a little bit more trouble with that experiment and getting back up on the lunar module. So Neil is kind of coaching him now that he's experienced.
Whoa. Very important to be able to get back.
Yeah. Also, on his way down, Neil told. Oh, no, I'll explain it in a second. And actually, Aldrin would say when Neil Armstrong said it's a magnificent sight and it has a stark beauty of all its own, Aldrin could say, this is not beautiful. But then he kind of just came to him. He said, it's magnificent desolation, which is a beautiful description of an odd kind of beauty, maybe. And this is the picture that Neil took of Armstrong, of Aldrin coming down the ladder. Now, the next step, Aldrin was setting up experiments, which Patrick will now explain to us.
Okay, yes. So you can see Aldrin setting up a piece of foil, which is designed to capture the solar wind. These are particles from the sun, pieces of particles, and he left that experiment on the surface of the moon for about 77 minutes. And so any pieces embedded and particles embedded in that in the aluminum foil would be studied afterwards, because they took that back with them. On the other experiments were actually listed on the list of tasks. Each astronaut had a glove, and they had a task list, like a checklist. And one of them was the early Apollo Scientific Experiment Package, ESEP. And this consisted of two experiments, one on the left here, which is a seismometer or seismograph seismometer to measure moonquakes. And Houston was able to, the scientists at Houston were able to actually listen to the footsteps of the astronauts because they walked too closely to it. So that was a good test that it worked. And even the movement inside the lunar module too. And then the other experiment was a reflector. It basically it would reflect light directed from the Earth and reflect it back. And the time it took round trip and knowing the speed of light would give you an accuracy, a measure of distance to the moon within a few inches. And it's still used today, but it's degraded somewhat. And then the other unexpected thing was the lunar surface probe. You can see it's circled right there. Just gives us an idea of how what the lunar soil mechanics is. So you can see that on the right-hand side, that surface probe is basically bent just right underneath the pad.
Then Armstrong and Aldrin both took photographs of the lunar module. This is one Aldrin took showing underneath the lunar module, showing that the soil wasn't disturbed very much. There's some evidence of things being blown out by the engine, but not a lot. And there's that mysterious bag.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, the aliens left it there before.
Well, actually, that was all the trash they had gathered up to that time. That was the first thing they put on the moon.
But another thing they put on the moon.
Yeah, what you won't see in First Man. The idea of, oh, they're talking to Mike Collins, who's orbiting overhead right now. He can't see any of this, of course.
Setting up the flag. Great.
I guess you're not the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the thing. Oh, it's beautiful, Mike, it really is. Yes, indeed, they got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the winter.
And that was a $3 flag purchased from a department store, to which a rod was added to make it look like it's blowing in the wind. And Aldrin taking a salute. And then Aldrin practiced walking around with different gaits to see what was the best way to walk in that low gravity.
I have to take about 2 or 3 paces to make sure that you got your feet underneath it.
That's how I expected.
Yes.
2 or 3 or maybe 4 easy.
And he intentionally walked up close to the camera, of course. In an unexpected phone call.
Hello, Neil and Buzz. I'm talking to you by telephone from the Oval Room of the White House. And this certainly has to be the most historic telephone call ever made. I just can't tell you how proud we all are of what you do. For every American, this has to be the proudest day of our lives. And for people all over the world, I am sure they too join with America. I mean, what an immense feat this is. For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. One in their pride in what you have done, and one in our prayers that you will return safely to earth.
So, and now, most of the time, Neil Armstrong had the one Hasselblad camera that they carried. So most of the pictures are of Aldrin on the moon. But there is one time where Buzz Aldrin had the camera, and he was taking engineering pictures, and he happened to catch Neil Armstrong. Can you see him? Well, so this is the only Hasselblad picture of Neil Armstrong on the moon, and here's an enlargement and somewhat enhancement so you can kind of make him out. So I guess Armstrong is maybe a little more artistic with the camera, but Aldrin was more business-oriented, so he wasn't thinking of that. This is a famous picture towards the end of the EVA where Armstrong took a picture of Aldrin that actually reflected himself in the faceplate. You can see the lunar module and the figure of Neil Armstrong standing there too.
So what was the total duration of the EVA, or extravehicular activity?
It's a little over 2 hours.
2 hours and 31 minutes.
Yeah.
So they had only landed on the moon a couple hours earlier, 2 or 3, I guess it was around,
Yeah,
they
it was
sat there
around
for
noon
about
our
5
time.
or
It's around
6?
6 hours, yeah.
6 hours, and then 2 hours, a little over 2 hours on the surface.
Yeah, and they were originally going to take a sleep break before, but then
Yeah,
they
right.
were so, adrenaline filled and said, "There's no way we're going to sleep. Let's just do this."
I'm tired, let's go to sleep.
And they
This is
actually never
boring.
got any sleep on the moon.
was very cold
After the
inside.
EVA, they just were too uncomfortable to sleep while it was too cold. They could have warmed things up by opening the window shades, but then it would have been too bright, so they just rested, but uncomfortably.
So apart from the trash bag that was left on the moon, these were items that were left on the moon. The patch of Apollo 1, and on the right, a silicon disk containing messages from over 70 heads of state from planet Earth. Also a olive branch, gold olive branch, and 2 medals to honor 2 Soviet cosmonauts, Yuri Gagarin and Vladimir Komarov. Also on the just near the base of the lunar ladder is of course the famous plaque, which was signed by the 3 astronauts and the president of that time. And also left on the moon is a picture taken before and after boot print, which will be there on the moon for millions of years undisturbed because there's no atmosphere. Only the soft rain of micrometeorites will weather it down for over a million years.
And just to destroy any illusion, that wasn't the first footprint on the moon, but it was one that Buzz Aldrin took intentionally to study the engineering properties of lunar soil.
Not to document the profundity of a human footprint on the moon?
Well, it
just
was
to
his
do some
footprint.
engineering.
Yeah.
Right.
Yep.
This is a map of where the astronauts walked, and the furthest they walked was when Neil Armstrong walked 200 feet to Little West Crater. And the next slide, we actually see a picture was taken in 2012 from the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, just about 15 miles above the surface, and you can still see those trails of footprints and some of the experiments that were left on the moon. From this vantage point, Neil Armstrong was able to take this picture, I think one of the last pictures before he left.
And he actually wasn't really supposed to go that far from the lunar module, but he was out of the TV view, and he figured if he did it quick, he couldn't be told not to. So he went in, because that was the most interesting feature that they had landed close to.
He might have left his daughter's bracelet.
Well, that's what they show in First Man, and according to his biographer, it is a possibility that he may have done something like that, but he never said, so we really don't know.
We'll have to go back to the moon and find it and see if it's there.
She's buried in the Lancaster Cemetery.
So shortly after that, they set out?
That's right. So then they basically gathered their moon rocks and stuff and then went back up into the lunar module. Here we see Neil Armstrong leaving the surface of the moon. No ceremony to it or anything. They were done with their work.
Off the surface at 1:11:37:32.
And then it was time for liftoff, and we can run the video of the liftoff. This, in fact, was taken 16 seconds afterwards. And then 3 hours later, there was the docking.
So an image taken from Michael Collins
Michael
in the
Collins,
command
yes.
module.
So something happened before the liftoff, and because the video was delayed, we don't know exactly why. But anyway, there was a little bit of a problem, and that was that when they got into the lunar module, it was noticed that one of the circuit breaker switches was broken. And it happened to be one called engine arm, which actually enables the ascent engine of the lunar module to fire. So they weren't sure if it was armed or not. So then the next thing Buzz Aldrin did was he actually had a pen, and he literally pushed that pen into the circuit breaker switch just to make sure the circuit breaker was enabled and they can actually light the engine and take off. And that pen is now on display in the Museum of Flight in Seattle, and that's the actual pen he used.
So,
So it was, one pen was,
right, were it not for the pen.
yeah. So now that they were firmly docked, we can go to the next slide. It was time, after several hours, to eject the lunar module, and it basically went around the moon several times until the lunar gravity captured it, and it's crashed somewhere on the moon. Someday someone will find it and make a tourist site of it if they can find the crash site. But they basically, next step was to do the reverse. Instead of a trans-lunar injection, it was a trans-Earth injection, firing the engine and setting the course towards Earth. A look back from towards the moon as they receded away, and watched the Earth grow bigger and bigger as they approached it. We'll go to the next slide. And then the next step was the sequence for a splashdown, where the command module capsule would separate from the service module, and then the command module would literally re-enter the Earth's atmosphere, and then parachutes will deploy, and it would land in the Pacific Ocean. So here are the pictures, and even a close-up in the gray suits. And celebrations, of course, rang at Mission Control and all over the world.
Yeah, you'd think the astronauts came back and they'd go get a pizza, they'd enjoy, but no, they were put into a trailer. They had quarantine. People were worried about moon bugs or bacteria or germs or who knows what they could bring back. So they were put into a quarantine. And of course, they met Nixon there. They even had to go through visa entries. They had to go through customs, believe it or not, and they were approved. So that happened. But this is the real customs form. If you look carefully, it says coming from the moon, entering in Hawaii. Actually, they had to declare, we brought moon rocks with us. No joke. This customs takes this stuff very seriously. So Buzz Aldrin tweeted about this recently. We're not making this up. They were in that trailer for 21 days. That plastic part connected it to the command module so they could go back in there and get some of the effects they had left in there and bring them into the trailer with them. They even had to visit with their wives through there. So 21 days later, they finally came out to much celebration. So.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I was getting you set up.
Oh, no,
Or-
just, that's all there is to say, really, lots of celebration.
And that
yes.
celebration took place on August 13th.
Okay.
And they were released just about 3 days later from the quarantine. So,
May I tell a personal story? I'm sorry to everyone here, but I just have to tell a personal story. My sister Anne was flying to Colorado and lost her luggage on TWA right after this. Who else was flying to Colorado but the astronauts? And Neil Armstrong lost his luggage on TWA. So they met in the baggage claim, recovered luggage. Can you imagine? But so my sister had this great story. She saw Neil Armstrong. He had just been this great American hero. Went over to him, Commander Armstrong, can I shake your hand? Shook his hand and smashed his funny bone into the counter. And he went, oh. So that's one proud moment of family history I just had to share. So right after this, because indeed they went to Colorado to a ranch to get some rest and relaxation afterward and heal up. So anyway.
So after the moon rocks were cleared by customs, they entered the lunar receiving lab, and here you see all the moon rocks in a box with other samples in a vacuum chamber. And you can see the scientists starting in earnest to study those moon rocks, revealing the ancient history of the moon and our solar system.
Exactly. Those moon rocks are some of the surest evidence that we actually went. Yet there's a lot of folks out there that think this is how it was done. On a sound stage with multiple light sources, wires attached to the astronauts so they could bounce around in the low gravity, and it was all directed by Doge. Anyway, but no, we built hardware. There's evidence that lots of hardware was built. Lots and lots of people worked on that. It was something like over 400,000 people were involved in making it. Yet none of those people came forward and said, this hardware wouldn't work. This isn't going to get people to the moon. This is going to leak. This is going to have problems. I mean, there were problems along the way, sure, but they were things they were aiming to solve. Also, all those computer monitors and displays and printout displays in that room all had real data being displayed. So all of that data had to be faked because other people could watch over the shoulders of these. There were cameras recording it going on. So you had to fake every little bit of data in there that all these people were looking at. And either these people were all in on it and they knew the data was fake, or that data had to be accurate, showing them what they expected to see as the spacecraft traveled to the moon, landed there, and brought humans there and back. All that had to be faked. We had to fake, well, we didn't fake the launch. People saw it happen. We actually had to build the hardware and launch it. The hardware had to behave as it should behave on its way to the moon. These are, the very top part are drawings made by some folks of what they saw, and these are photographs. Now, these are not NASA photographs. These are just folks on Earth that were watching that trans-lunar injection burn where the rocket was firing to the moon. So we had to fire a rocket to the moon. Panels would have blown off in this way and been headed out. Well, again, folks got pictures of the hardware doing exactly what we said it would do. The Russians had ships like these throughout the Apollo program, and they were able to capture the radio signals coming from the spacecraft and the astronauts talking, answering questions. So we had to pre-record every little bit of all those astronaut conversations and put them on a spacecraft and time it and or trigger them to respond to us when we asked them questions with the proper delay and all of that, or whatever we're doing. Or the Russians would have said, hey, these signals aren't coming from a spacecraft. They're not coming from the moon. And they never did. The Soviets would have had a reason to say the Americans didn't go. They were in competition with us, and they didn't. And then on top of it, you know, Neil Armstrong got this photograph. He went there, and yet, well, where's the sound stage with all this gray dirt? Or where is the matte painting in the background? Where are the artists that made all this stuff? Nobody's come forward and said they made it. Future missions, we went to even more dramatic sites, brought a rover with us. So we had to build an electric car and drive it around some sort of mammoth soundstage. We even had to pump the air out of the soundstage because the rooster tails of dirt don't create clouds of dust. If you throw up a handful of dust here on Earth, it billows in the air, sinks slowly. Didn't happen in any of the footage. So we had to pump all the air out of the sound stages. And the matte paintings, just again, how many of them are there? There's lots of different landscapes in the background, yet I don't know where they're stored. I haven't seen them. Also, where are the stars in the background is a complaint a lot of folks have. So, well, I did a little experiment. Went to Griffith Observatory, traveled all the way to that famous institution. Took a photograph. This is a short exposure. The only thing we're changing here is exposure time. You could also change the aperture. You could open it up a little more, but exposure time effectively does the same thing. Now we expose a little longer, and now you can start to kind of see clouds up here, and you're seeing some more detail. Things still look all right. Expose a little longer. Beginning to see clouds, beginning to see the cupola, the top of the building, but we're starting to lose some detail in the brightest regions. Now we'll go even brighter, and now all of a sudden it's completely blown out. We don't see really any detail right here. We're overexposed. We're seeing lots of detail here, and we're seeing clouds. No stars, although we can see stars in LA. People think we can't. We see a few. This is just a fact of dynamic range of cameras. This is a modern digital camera that even has a better dynamic range than what they brought to the moon. So your choice is, what do you want photographs of? You go to the moon. Here's what you can do. You can get that picture and expose it a little bit. Things aren't very well exposed. The moon's surface is kind of okay. The Earth is okay. Expose a little longer. And now we have a picture that's great. We can see the moon, and over here we see the Earth. Everything looks good. No stars, though. So if we wanted to prove to people there are stars in those photographs, expose even longer. Sure, you see stars, but you no longer see the Earth or the moon. You don't go all the way to the moon to take pictures of stars. You go there to get this picture. This is the drama. This is what we're excited about. We can see stars from Earth. Although There are reasons to build telescopes on the moon. We'll talk about that later in the week, maybe. Now, some folks want to know, why do shadows look like they're going different directions? You might say, well, this shadow looks like it's kind of going that way, and these ones look like they're going down. 2 different light sources. Aha, I got it. They never went. I took this picture on my walk up to work. Those shadows aren't going the same direction, and there was only one sun. I didn't have extra flashlights or anything. This is called perspective. We figured that out in the Renaissance. Another shot on my walk up, shadows look like they're going the same direction. A little bit of this is relief as well. If you have different heights, shadows will tend to go different directions along the different hill. Now, like Patrick said, we left this instrument behind on the moon, and indeed it bounces light back the same direction it comes. It's like a big bike reflector, essentially, a really, really high quality one. But reflectors on bikes, when a car shines light on it, it bounces light right back to the car so the driver sees those reflectors. Well, the Mythbusters did an episode. Phil Plait, the bad astronomer that did a whole moon thing like this, proved it wasn't hoaxed. Originally, well, he helped them do an episode where they did a lot of these same things, and they shot a laser beam out of Point Apache. They hit the moon, and if they hit just the right spot of the moon, if you're a little bit off, you get no return signal. But if you're right where the astronauts left that instrument, you get a signal back, and you get it with the right delay. Like Patrick said, the speed of light is finite, so it goes out there, comes back. It's the right distance. You know you've hit the moon and you've hit there. On top of it, all those rocks that were brought back by the astronauts, you don't get rocks like that on Earth. First of all, their composition is somewhat similar, but they have these things called micrometeorite impacts in them. Little tiny grains of sand that form beautiful meteors in our sky. During meteor showers, you see a streak of light, a shooting star. Well, those make it all the way to the surface of the moon, and they run into the rocks and they leave little tiny craters. On Earth, that doesn't happen. So we know the rocks they brought back were in a vacuum somewhere. So they either went to the moon or they did even a harder mission and went to an asteroid or something to grab a bunch of material. Also, the sphere in the lower right is a glass sphere. Those only form, well, they form when you get big impacts. When an asteroid or a large object smashes into the Earth or the moon, these little glass spheres form. They melt, they solidify. On Earth, they weather away. Rainstorms, windstorms, things like that, they disappear rather quickly. On the moon, they just stick around. So they're all over the place on the moon. You see them everywhere, and they were included in the samples we brought back. And the one on the lower right even has a little impact crater on it. So it was hit by an even smaller piece of space debris. So that's, you don't see that on Earth. The Japanese, their Selene spacecraft, imaged the landing site, and you can see it's sort of disturbed there. It's a little bit lighter. Now you might think, well, that's kind of blurry, it's not super high quality, but they did get good radar data. They got heights, and they made, well, an image on the left, they simulated from their height information and their color information, they simulated what the astronauts on the ground should have seen. The right-hand side is what the picture we took 50 years ago. The left-hand side is what the Japanese simulated about 10, 12 years ago. So either the Japanese space program is still helping us fake it as of last decade, or again, we really went to the moon. The Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter that Patrick showed a picture of, again, that's a NASA spacecraft with a 12-inch telescope. You'd need a telescope something like a mile wide here on Earth to see these things. We went to the moon, and you can see all the landing sites. Indeed, the ground around them is disturbed. This is the Apollo 17 landing site. The Challenger descent stage is here. You can see it blown up there. All the equipment they left behind, the trails they left. And if you look carefully, these tracks are doubled. There's two. Those are tire marks. Those are tire tracks left behind the lunar rover. So pretty cool. They had a rover with them, and they did that. A lot of folks might want to know, well, sure, okay, you think you went, but if we really went to the moon, we should have been still going back. Why haven't we gone back there? The answer is really a thing of national will. Do we really want to go? It costs money to go, and you can see the federal budget. And the percentage of the federal budget gives you an idea of how important it is to Congress and the President of the United States. So with the Apollo program, the budget peaked a little above 4%. Rapidly dropped as the program was accomplished, little lower than 1% by 1976. 1% of the federal budget. It drops to under 0.5% by the 2006, 2009 in there. We also had a space shuttle we ran. We built a space station. We did it with the Russians, Soviet Union first and the Russians. But that said, that's not enough money left over behind to go back to the moon. You just can't do it. It costs too much. So if we really want to go back to the moon, we're going to have to spend the money to do it. You need to invest in it. It can't just happen on its own. So all that said, I really do think we left that boot print, that engineering print on the ground, and we went to the moon. So, yeah, thank you.
And so, as we mentioned before, this is just one of a series of celebrations of the Apollo missions. These are the mission patches. Let me take a look closely. And so those were the dates of the actual missions. These are the dates of our celebrations. So I hope you'll come back for future Apollo celebrations. And of course, this week, there's a lot of Apollo 11 on that, but that's because we have a lot of celebrations. From California to the Moon is the one that I mentioned, Meet the Engineers. On Thursday, a fascinating panel that Tony will be moderating about why we went, was it worth it? Should we go again? Will we go again? What will that look like? Who will do it? Will it be an American enterprise, an international enterprise, or private enterprise? I'm very excited about that panel. On the 19th, on Friday, we have a showing of the Apollo 11 movie. And again, if you haven't seen it, it's fantastic. And there's a special after-film screening, after-hours rooftop party with Friends of the Observatory. So if you want to support Friends of the Observatory and the ways they support Griffith Observatory, please come to our party and see that fantastic film.
May I say one thing about it?
Yeah.
If you're one of those people who say, gee, I wish I were alive when Apollo 11 flew, if only, I would say, and actually I've even heard astronauts who've been to the moon say that's the closest probably you'll get to that feeling. It's really done as an experience. It's not talking heads explaining it.
Yeah.
Lets you experience that excitement again.
Yeah, it's all just the footage itself. There's no narrator.
And newly found footage that we didn't know existed.
And if you come to the party, you get to stay in the building after we close.
Or on the roof. On
the
Saturday, which
building.
is the actual day we landed and walked on the moon, we're going to have a series of presentations all day long. Short ones, about half an hour, but past, present, and future, including the talk David alluded to about mysteries of the moon. What have we learned about the moon? What do we need to learn about it? On Sunday night, Leonard David, veteran space journalist, as we call him. Yes, veteran, otherwise known as, he's been around from the beginning and has a font of knowledge. And he has a book out called Moonrush. We'll have a talk between Leonard David and Lon Raines, who is the vice president for communications of Northrop Grumman, and also former editor of Space News, among others. So these may be two of the most knowledgeable space historians on the planet will be here on Sunday night. And then Monday night, again, with Friends of the Observatory, our own Griffith Observatory director, Edwin C. Krupp, will be giving a talk on, about the meaning of these missions in the scope of the human endeavor. So then lastly, we will end on the 24th with us remembering. So it'll be sort of a shortened version of this, but a look back on highlights from all of this festival celebration. So we do hope you'll join us, or join us through our Griffith Observatory TV on live stream or YouTube. And we thank you again for coming here today, and we thank our live stream audience for tuning in, and we all hope you have a wonderful day at Griffith Observatory.